Part 3 of the endocrine system. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. It's composed of two separate glands, the adrenal cortex and the outer rim, which is epithelial tissue, and we'll learn about the different parts of that gland in another slide. And the adrenal medulla, which is also a gland but composed of nerve tissue. The adrenal medulla is a place where epinephrine and norepinephrine is made. It's primarily epinephrine that's made, but you'll recall the epinephrine and norepinephrine were neurotransmitters as well from the sympathetic nervous system. It acts in the same way in fight or flight, and its effects are to increase the heart rate and blood pressure, which we know are those aspects of fight or flight. It also dilates the respiratory passageways, meaning that it's easier for air to flow. Blood is going to be sent to your brain, your heart, and your skeletal muscle, which are the organs that you need to have functioning well during an emergency situation. And it's going to be producing ATP, an energy source, by breaking down glycogen that's stored away in fatty acid to provide the body with more energy to deal with an emergency. The adrenal cortex, which is in the outer region of the adrenal gland, is actually composed of three separate layers. So if this is the capsule, meaning that out on the top over here would be outside of the organ. The capsule will be the outer rim. And then if we look carefully, we see three layers. Layer number 1, layer number 2, and then layer number 3. These three layers are all secreting steroid hormones, and the layer on top near the capsule is called the zona glomerulosa, where the steroid hormone aldosterone is produced. This is a hormone that you've heard about and its role in blood pressure and sodium reabsorption. The second layer is the zona fasciculata, and this is a place where the steroid hormone cortisol is made. And the third layer is called the reticularis, zona reticularis, and here there's a little bit of sex hormones are made. Below that we see the adrenal medulla. Starting with aldosterone, the zona glomerulosa, that outer rim, is going to be secreting aldosterone. When blood pressure is going down or your sodium ion concentration is going down, that will also stimulate the kidney to release renin. So renin is going to have angiotensinogen, a precursor molecule in the plasma, be converted into angiotensin 1, which is then converted in the lungs to angiotensin 2. And this angiotensin 2 is then the substance that's going to stimulate aldosterone secretion from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone is going to act on the kidneys to cause sodium ion retention. And when you're retaining sodium, you're also retaining water. You're holding on to water as well. So this is going to raise your blood pressure, and so you conserve sodium ions and you eliminate potassium ions. Cortisol, which is produced by the zona fasciculata, the second layer in the adrenal cortex, is also known as the stress hormone. So it basically inhibits the immune system. When cortisol is released, lipids and proteins are used for energy instead of carbohydrates. Here we see when we're having stimulation to release cortisol, it's a 3-step process that we had learned in the previous handout. So the hypothalamus is going to cause a releasing hormone to affect the anterior pituitary, which will then release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. That hormone will go through the blood and come to the adrenal cortex, where it affects the zona fasciculata to release cortisol. When cortisol is released, it's going to affect its target cells. It's going to stop or inhibit protein synthesis. It's going to promote the release of fatty acids and stimulate glucose formation. And then the levels of cortisol that are in the blood is going to inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing more CRH, and that will shut down the steps of this pathway. So we're looking at negative feedback. The zona reticularis makes small amounts of androgens, and these can be converted actually into estrogens as well. And it's not exactly clear, but it may be involved in sex drive, may be involved in the development of male reproductive organs. Moving on to the next gland, we are talking about the pancreatic islets, the part of the pancreas that's the endocrine pancreas. Most of the pancreatic tissue is exocrine pancreas that we learned about last semester when we were learning the digestive system. Pancreatic juice that was made, those enzymes of the exocrine pancreas, if you recall, are produced. They travel through the duct system into the small intestine. But now we're not interested in the exocrine pancreas, which we could see here enlarged. We see the cells that make these digestive enzymes that are going to go into a duct system. Instead, spread out throughout the tissue of the pancreas, there are little pockets of cells that are not organized around a duct. These are the islets of Langerhans, and they are going to be secreting hormones. This is what you saw in the laboratory. The arrangement of the exocrine pancreas was very organized, and then you came to unorganized patches of cells that are not sitting around ducts, and these are hormone-secreting cells, the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. The two hormones we're going to focus on that are produced here are glucagon, which is made by the alpha cells, and insulin, which is made by the beta cells. So we're going to ask the question, when is glucagon released? When is insulin released? Glucagon is released when your blood glucose levels are low, and insulin is released when your blood glucose levels are high. So these two hormones are working in opposite directions to help control your blood glucose levels. Glucagon is going to break down glycogen. Blood glucose levels are low, so with glycogen breakdown, you're going to produce more glucose to be in the blood. In the case of insulin, where you're looking at high blood glucose levels, so you're going to synthesize glycogen. You're going to be pulling glucose out of the blood to create glycogen that will be stored away. The net effect of glucagon is you're going to form the glucose that will help bring your blood glucose back to normal level. In the case of insulin, the effect of insulin is, since you already have high glucose levels, you don't want to form more glucose from other sources, so you're not going to be making any more insulin from non-carbohydrates, and glucose is taken up out of the blood and deposited in many cells, particularly in adipose cells and muscle cells. The action of glucagon is to increase blood glucose levels. The action of insulin is to decrease blood glucose levels. So in each case, they will go through similar processes, but in opposite directions. Diabetes mellitus, which is the kind of diabetes that happens when you have an issue with insulin, can happen either because you don't have enough insulin, you're not making enough insulin, which is type 1, which is also known as juvenile diabetes. The other kind of diabetes, which is also known as late onset, is type 2 diabetes, where you do make insulin, but your cells are insulin resistant. They're not responding. Their receptors are not responding to the insulin. Either way, you're going to have high glucose levels in your blood, which is hyperglycemia. When you have elevated blood glucose, it ends up in your urine, and we'll learn more about that in the urinary chapter. And the three signs, they're known as the 3 signs of diabetes mellitus, is polyuria, that there's a high urine output, which is resulting from, it's like the water will follow the sugar into the urine, so you have a higher urine output. Polydipsia, which then causes excessive thirst because you're losing more water in your urine. And polyphagia, which is excessive hunger and eating. The issues that come from diabetes mellitus are very significant, and it's important that this be treated and kept under control, because when high glucose levels in the blood remain, it starts destroying the small capillaries in different parts of the body, and your blood circulation becomes poor and causes a lot of damage when your capillaries go, in particular in your kidneys, in your retina, neuropathies, your nervous system, and you have heart issues as well. Moving on to the next gland, we'll look at the pineal. The pineal gland, you'll remember, is in the brain. The pineal gland, it's actually sensitive to light. When the cells of the pinealocytes, are in the dark, they are going to synthesize melatonin. And they are involved in the rhythms of the body, onset of puberty, circadian rhythms, body temperature, sleep cycles. The reproductive cycle follows certain rhythms, and it also protects against free radical damage. The kidneys as an endocrine organ, we're just going to briefly mention here the secretions of the kidneys, but you'll hear more about this in the next handout. So we'll just briefly mention that the kidneys form vitamin D, calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And this occurs when parathyroid hormone is present, and the vitamin D will be important for calcium absorption. The kidneys also makes erythropoietin, which you learned about, which is important for producing red blood cells, and renin, which released from the kidney when sodium levels are low or your blood pressure is low, and that's going to form angiotensin, and that will result in the secretion of aldosterone from, if you remember, we just covered this, released from the adrenal cortex, specifically from the zona glomerulosa. This is going to be in the next handout, so I'm going to skip over this now, and you'll hear more about this in the next handout. So other hormone-producing structures, a lot of different organs produce hormones. The heart produces hormones. You learned about the natriuretic peptides. When blood pressure is high, these are released so that blood pressure will be reduced. The skin produces a vitamin D precursor, so the skin is also a hormone-producing structure. The ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. The testes produce testosterone. We'll learn more about that when we cover the reproductive organs. We'll learn about this when we cover the placenta, but these are hormones released by the placenta. And then the intestines actually produce a variety of hormones that act locally, that help to coordinate the digestion. We learned about hormones produced by the thymus. You'll recall the thymocytes that are important in the development of T lymphocytes. We never really discussed this in any detail, but even adipose tissue has hormones that are released. One of the hormones involved in appetite is known as leptin, but there's also a hormone that's involved with insulin called resistin. And then they keep discovering new places that hormones are made. The story is not fully written about all the different hormones of our body. I used to give a test question, which organ doesn't produce hormones, and I would list a bunch of organs and include bone, meaning that bone, I expected people to answer that bone doesn't produce a hormone, and then in 2007 they found that it does. It's a hormone that's involved in regulating bone growth. So this is still stuff that and research continues in this area. Hormones can interact in different ways. Sometimes you can have two hormones that act antagonistic. Let's say, for example, insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones. They work in opposite directions. One increases glucose, one decreases glucose. They work together to control glucose. But some are additive, so that there are effects that it's not just one hormone working, but more than one to make something happen. And in the next slide, we'll see a list of hormones that all act together for growth. Some hormones act in a permissive effect, where you need one hormone to be present so that the other hormone can have an effect. And integrative is when hormones produce different results, but both results are important and they complement each other. Human growth actually involves a whole bunch of hormones, and they're listed here. And all of these are necessary in order to develop normal growth. We'll quickly look at the general adaptation syndrome. You don't need to know the whole list, but you should just be aware that when our body goes into crisis, we go through 3 stages if things don't resolve. In stage 1, that's when your body is in a crisis. We go into fight or flight mode. Your adrenal medulla is active. It's going to be mobilizing your glycogen and lipid reserves. Your body is in crisis mode. If that doesn't take care of the issue, you go into a chronic condition, which is much longer term. This is a short-term response. There's a much longer metabolic response, which is called the resistance phase, and that has a lot to do with cortisol secretion, and the body will conserve glucose. That's one of the things that it does. It's going to use lipids, amino acids, a source for energy, and conserve glucose as long as possible. This will, again, not last forever. The system will eventually start to deteriorate. And finally, if this doesn't resolve, you go into stage 3 when you've basically exhausted all your reserves. In other words, if you've used up all your lipid reserves, you've used up your amino acids, your body goes into collapse, and electrolyte balance fails. You go into failure of many different organ systems, and that can lead ultimately to death. Hormones affect behavior. Some hormones are involved in your emotional state. So if your hormones are fluctuating because of an emotional state, it can affect all of these different things. And lifespan changes, as usual, I don't like to read. You're welcome to read these on your own. And that brings us to the end of the endocrine section.